Alistair then compressed his lips in a tight line. No. You eat enough already, Theopalu. We do not have enough rations to make this trip if you keep eating the way you have been. Yeah, I got some, Kidka said quickly, seemingly grateful for the opportunity to leave Lance's company as he lightly jogged over to where the old elf sat. Lance shook her head and gave a small laugh. Old Theopalu, you truly haven't changed at all. Whoa. Whoa. Alistair shouted, hand tightening on the shaft of his warhammer as he took a quick step backward. Where the hells did she come from? Nolvi glanced up at him, a quirk to her brow. You didn't hear her and Kidka talking? She asked dully. Your ears are broken, Nolvi stated flatly before continuing to stare holes into the dirt. I had not heard her either, Twindle whispered, a hint of embarrassment in her tone, as she tucked a long lock of blonde hair behind one ear. Personally, nothing gets past me. Except this once. Elum said after a moment. Damn quiet they are. But at least they aren't hiding anymore? Elum asked, sounding uncertain as to if that were a good thing. Was that why Lance had come out? Because she had recognized Theopalu. Even so, she should have maintained the flank in case Theopalu had turned traitor to the Watchers. The old elf had brought strangers into the forward. He should have been regarded with at least a smidgen of suspicion. And if she had indeed recognized Theopalu, then why did she approach Kidka first? Why had the men looked so nervous talking with her? Hoplite stared as Kidka pulled out a large piece of hardtack, handing it to the old elf, while Alistair glared daggers at Kidka. The old elf, Theopalu, wasted no time in consuming the fist-sized morsel. Hoplite stared in near bafflement as he saw the elf swallow the hardtack without chewing it. It was as if Theopalu's throat had expanded to allow it to fall straight into his stomach. Perhaps elves were more mutated than he thought. But then, why was Lance staring in near horrified shock at Theopalu? If all elves could eat like that, then she would not be staring at Theopalu in such a way. You really haven't changed at all, have you? Lance asked Theopalu, the latter merely shrugging in response. How's the outside world been treating you? Theopalu shrugged again before replying curtly with it, is fine. Well, that's good, Theopalu. But you haven't been teaching our ways to outsiders, have you? Lance asked him, her eyes turning to daggers as she approached the still-sitting elf after all. This lad is young enough to have been raised by you on your time off. It's been what, 20 years? You didn't take a human apprentice in that time, right? Lance asked him. You know what would have to be done. She finished in a tone as deadly serious as Hoplite had ever heard. Theopalu then shook his head. No. Just met him a few days ago. The boy just got a great eye. Should have been born an elf. I see, Lance said after a moment, turning her head back to Kidka. The man seemed to seize up the moment Lance's eyes found his, and he forced out another awkward cough before the blonde elf girl, Twindle, approached Lance. Hoplite kept a firm eye on the blonde elf, reading her body language for any signs of aggression. If Twindle became hostile, Hoplite would blow her away in an instant. However, Hoplite saw no signs of hostility in Twindle's body language. The paladin only seemed curious about Lance. Twindle's face in wonder as she gently reached out a hand, giving a small smile. He just does that. I've never really had a chance to, talk to one of you before, Twindle said with brief hesitation. Well, Besides Theopalu anyway, she said quickly, but he doesn't like to talk. See, I'm actually half elf, and I was wanting to ask if that's enough. Hoplite cut in. What are you all doing here? He asked, checking the trees above to see the current positions of the watchers overhead. They had become suddenly very still on his tracker, disappearing in their stillness. Yet, when Hoplite checked the camera, he could see none of them. They had seemingly all left while he was preoccupied with dealing with these strangers. Why would they do that? The situation hadn't been resolved. Perhaps they thought their time could be better spent on neutralizing the dozens of fiends still wandering the Foulwood. If that was what they had left for, then Hoplite could hardly bring himself to blame them. Twindle jumped at hearing his voice, her plate armor clinking together as she stared at Hoplite with wide eyes. "We're making our way toward the fiend wall," she told him, taking a breath to calm herself, before continuing. "We hired Theopalu to guide us through the Foulwood to reach it." She smiled again. After all, Athena wouldn't approve of such chaos spreading through the land. "I will purge it." Yet in truth, that is not the only reason we are heading for the fiend wall. This tragedy just happened to occur on our journey. We came upon this. Did you call it a pod? Alistair asked before continuing on the way there. And I'm going to be completely honest with you here. We were going to try and loot it. Alistair said honestly, shrugging broad shoulders. "We didn't know it was yours, okay? No harm, no foul." "Gotta ask, though," he said, lifting an eyebrow at Hoplite. "Is this one of the falling stars?" Pretty much everyone saw at least a few of them during the starfall. Can't help but notice that this place looks like it got split down the middle, like it crashed here. They weren't stars. They were escape pods. Hoplite told him, "Have you found any others? Were there any humans in them?" The party of mutated misfits all began staring at one another, all save for Nolvi before they began shaking their heads. It was as Hoplite had previously thought. If these people had been arriving from the west, it was unlikely that any pods had crashed on that side of the planet during the initial and only ejections. This wasn't the first time Hoplite had heard the mass evacuation referred to as the Starfall. Apparently, it was becoming more commonly known as such. This at least confirmed that there were likely no shuttles that had landed in the west. If Hoplite wanted to link back up with Turton personnel, he'd need to head to the east as he had planned. He opened his mouth to begin speaking, but began shouting instead when his motion tracker began picking up on several frenetic blips, all converging on their location. These past few days of combating fiends had taught him how they'd appear on his motion tracker. The blips were jagged and wild in their approach, drawing through the round tracker on his HUD from all directions. "Hostiles inbound." Hoplite shouted, "Fiends incoming from all directions. Get ready." With that, the roaring of beasts, half dead, could be heard. Growling maws that desired naught else but to tear all those unafflicted with their mutation to pieces. Thankfully, the strangers did not question this. Indeed, it seemed as if they had grown used to being attacked by fiends during their journey through the woods. A good thing, for they reacted swiftly. All save for Theopalu, who opted to remain sitting. Nolvi quickly stepped behind Twindle, who drew a massive greatsword, holding it at the ready. Alistair quickly ran over, taking up a position next to Twindle. Kitka moved to stand closer to Alum, as the red mutant held his hands outward to the surrounding forest. Hoplite didn't know what Alum planned to do with just his hands. The thin man was not built for wrestling. Then they were upon them, all chittering beasts and critters of all shapes and sizes. Apes and dogs, boars and weasels, and a couple of bears to boot. Hoplite was not sure that he could save everyone from the encroaching fiends, but he would try. He aimed the Magnus at the first bear, the beast roaring as it charged directly for him. The blast tore through the creature's skull with ease, spattering rotted brain matter across the trees, while stray pellets tore into other beasts. While that happened, Illum's hands began glowing a shade of green. Hoplite, almost completely dumbfounded, watched as the red mutant began lobbing balls of green liquid at the approaching fiends. They had simply appeared out of thin air above his hands. How, Hoplite did not know. The balls of liquid impacted with the second bear that had been approaching, the matted fur melting away in an instant with a sizzle. The acid ate through the bear's skull and left only a stump of bone where the broad head had been. The body sliding to a stop right before Illum, who backed away with a curse as the miasma seeped out of the headless corpse. Before Hoplite could process what had just happened, he saw Alistair's own hand suddenly catch flame. A brilliant golden fire enveloped his entire palm, and the man slapped it atop his warhammer, the metal seeming to take the entire flame in that instant and leaving Alistair's hand bare of any burns. Some kind of bionic had to be at work there. Flame and acid did not just come out of people's hands. Alistair then reared the hammer back and swung it into the skull of a dog, knocking it far back into the growing crowd of fiends with an explosion of gore. This golden flame spread from the hammer on impact, launching several bits of flaming skull toward the fiends. Each piece that landed on top of a fiend caught that one on fire in turn, and soon there were dozens of fiends blazing with the golden fire, all seizing up and they were just gone. For the briefest of milliseconds, before the flame completely took them, the skeletons of the diseased animals were visible, as if Hoplite were seeing an X-ray through their putrid flesh. The golden flame seemed to consume them in their entirety, and not even the pink mist emerged once they were gone. There was not even ash where they had fallen. They were just gone. Hoplite kept firing the Magnus, forcing himself to stay focused on the combat at hand. There would be time to rationalize how this was all possible after the fact. Shells tore through dozens per shot, and unfortunately, Hoplite could not avoid hitting the trees with his rounds. There were simply too many fiends to afford caution. They seemed to pour out from all directions like a rotting flood of gnashing teeth. The strangers all flinched at the cacophonous roar of his shotgun, but showing extraordinary discipline, they stayed completely focused on the killing. Twindo swung her greatsword, the thick blade cleaving through 3 apes that had been jumping for her, the blade passing through the legs of the first one, then a torso, and finally a head. She retched on the pink miasma even as she stomped the now legless ape's skull, already swinging again into another pack of fiends. The angel Baumil swung its massive lower fists wildly, fighting like a savage gorilla as it snapped spines and crushed skulls beneath its mighty blows. The upper half of Baumil had intercepted an ape that had leaped from a high branch, catching both an ankle and a wrist before the mutant lifted the monkey high above its head, ripping the creature in half. Baumil did it with the ease of tearing paper, uncaring for both the pink miasma and the gore now coating its upper body. Lance slashed and dodged through the fiends in an intricate and bloody dance, working her 2 long daggers with a surgeon's precision. Limbs and heads flew off with every step she took, the diseased animals unable to even scratch her before she was already out of harm's way. Gitka fought with the same efficiency, ducking and weaving with careful counterattacks, with his longsword that split limbs and bodies, his sword painting the air a deeper shade of pink as the miasma continued to flow and mix into the growing mist surrounding the clearing. Nolvi just stared at the fiends. Yet when she did so, strange things would happen to the creature she sighted in on. They would stumble and trip over nothing, or a bone would shatter seemingly on its own. Surely it was just due to how rotted and decayed fiends were. She could not be injuring them by simply staring. Then suddenly, a wolf fiend's head simply exploded, and the veins on Nolvi's temples had bulged, her face going red with unseen effort. Again, Hoplite turned his attention away from thinking about the impossible, simply focusing on firing his shotgun until all of the hostiles were eliminated. Theopalu did nothing. The old man simply sat where he was and let the fiends pass over him, offering no resistance to the stampede. But what was strange was the fact that the fiends, they avoided him. Why would they avoid Theopalu? He wasn't infected. Focus. More balls of acid were flung, limbs severed, fiends blasted apart for a long while before finally the last of the creatures was dispatched with a firm stomp from Hop. He had used up all the shells left in the Magnus, and had to engage in close quarters. Those were shells that had been well spent, however, for Hoplite had killed at least 50 fiends in that short span of time with those remaining rounds. Why had so many appeared here like this? Hoplite had never had to fight off a wave this size. There had to be around 200 that had charged them all at once, which was why it was strange that they had suffered no casualties. Lance and the strangers were all perfectly fine, save for Kitka, who nursed a bleeding calf. It seemed as if one of the hounds had gotten its teeth into his leg, and unlike Twindle and Alistair, he wore no armor that could have stopped it. Was he infected now? If he was, then Kitka would have to be put down before he could pose a threat. Yet, if he could be treated in time, he could likely be saved. Apparently, lesser fiends had a more difficult time spreading the disease, but still, the wound could not be left to fester. Hoplite would retrieve some antibacterial gel from his pod, and then Twindle then approached Kitka, leaning down quickly and grabbing the wound. Was she a trained medical professional? The way she held it was certainly not how a gaping bite wound should be treated. Athena, seal this injury, so that he may be tranquil in life. Twindle whispered, clutching something at her neck. A golden glow then grew from her enclosed fist, and it traveled up and down her arms and onto Kitka's wound. Hoplite approached to get a closer look, and saw that the wound was closing. Yes, the injury was closing up on its own, the blood seeming to pull back into Kitka's body as the bite mark fully sealed, leaving not even a scar. Only nanomachines could heal so efficiently. Ah, that was it. It was nanomachines. True, nanomachines did not glow, or were even visible in any way. But there were no other explanations Hoplite could think of for how that wound had sealed so quickly. Yet there was a flaw with this idea, as nanomachines could not transfer from person to person. Each fleet of nanobots was tailored, for lack of better words, to the person hosting them. This was so the user's body wouldn't identify microscopic machines as a virus. Transferring nanomachines in such a way always resulted in intense fevers and bacterial infections, leading to death. It simply had to be something else that Twindle did to heal Kitka, but that begged the question. What had it been? Lance cleared her throat nervously, her face red beneath a head of sweat-matted hair. Saw? She breathed heavily. Some of you can do magic, she continued, clearly uncomfortable, I assume. That, well, you have to be sanctioned, yes? You are not pillar-born? She asked, suddenly serious. Glances passed between the strangers, save for Theopalu, who stared at a beetle crawling on a stump before grabbing it up and promptly eating it whole. It was a stag beetle. Yes. Twindle said after a moment's hesitation, I have my papers on me now, if you must look over them. And I'm Aether. Alistair huffed. Do you know of my people and our bond to the angels? Lance paused before nodding. Staring wide-eyed at Baomil, I knew what you were as soon as I laid eyes on your idol. Then you know that I didn't need Foundation to bring him here. If it will make you more comfortable, I'll dismiss him now. Alistair said, snapping his fingers. Hoplite goggled as Baomil completely vanished. He bumped his thermals to see if the mutant had gone invisible, but it was simply gone. The creature didn't even appear on his motion tracker. It was just gone. Lance eased up only slightly, approaching Twindle with a small shake to her step. Twindle gingerly handed Lance the papers, lips pursed as the watcher read over the laminated sheet. Lance gave a deep sigh of relief once she finished going over these sanctioning papers that Twindle provided. Hoplite himself saw the words, By the head of the cathedral of tranquil Athena, Twindle Mermu is sanctioned as a mortal. What did all of that mean? His eyes felt heavier than ever now as he gazed longingly at the pod. All he had to do was step inside and seal it shut. Then he could take care of himself and be done with all this nonsense. He'd be able to make better sense of all this once he was well and truly rested. No more fiends were inbound on his motion tracker. The field was completely still with the corpses of the fiends. Not a single one moved an inch from where it sat. The pink miasma still hung heavy in the air, making it apparently difficult for everyone else to breathe, all save for Theopalu, who merely yawned as if he were about to take a nap, still laying among the corpses of the fiends. If the combat was over, then it was time for Hoplite to take care of himself. Give them directions. Hoplite ordered Lance. Lance then turned to him, her brow knit together above glaring eyes. What had he done to receive such a look? We do want to get to the fiend wall, Miss Lance. Twindle huffed with another small smile, please. We can help push back the fiends when we get there. We don't mean any harm to these woods, truly. Athena's word on. Lance turned from Hoplite to smile back at Twindle. You are 3 days south. Lance huffed, wiping sweat from her brow, but old Theopalu there knows the way well enough. He used to be a watcher after all. Lance told her, sparing a brief glance at the older elf. Can't believe he'd come back to the Fallwood this soon after being sent on leave. Even if it didn't involve work. Hadn't Lance said it had been around 20 years? That was hardly so soon in Hoplite's opinion. More words passed between Lance and the strangers, but Hoplite heard none of it. His eyes were heavy and his limbs were lead pillars. It was time to rest, and he wasn't going to wait any longer. Lance, do you have control of this situation? Hoplite asked, as he turned toward the pod, approaching it with heavy footsteps. Yes, she told him with an eyebrow cock. Retreat if they turn hostile. I'll be in the pod. Hoplite told her, do not attempt to follow me in. I will open fire. He warned the group. Strangely, Ilum smiled. Taking a step toward Hoplite, your magic too? You sanctioned? I can open fire too, Hoplite raised a single broad finger toward the horned mutant as he approached Hoplite. Back, War. Hoplite ordered. The mutant's acid would not be able to eat through Hoplite's armor. If Elam became aggressive now, then Hoplite would simply snap his neck. Elam shook his head, sighing as he looked at the glaring Alistair with a grimace. I was just curious. Their words became nigh inaudible as Hoplite sealed the pod doors behind him. They continued speaking for a long while based on how long they hung around on his motion track. Hoplite clutched the visors, straining his bionic ears to their limit to pick up on any hostile tones. When the voices finally faded away without the sounds of conflict, Hoplite set about removing his armor, trying not to think about the things he had seen the strangers do. He may as well take care of his every need. He would eat, drink, and sleep. 4 hours should be enough, assuming that nothing attacked the pod or Lance. If there was a body of water nearby, he may take the time to wash as well. That would mean potential exposure to toxins in the environment, not to mention the potential for wounds to be sustained in a sudden combat situation. But he was fairly confident that he could rinse and be back to the pod before any incident occurred. If other normal humans could survive exposure on this planet, then surely Hoplite could as well. His immune system was incredibly deadly to all forms of contagions. When he was finally free of his armor, he ravenously tore into rations and full canteens of water, guzzling them down as if he were drowning before slumping over on a row of the seats, sleep ready to claim him. As his eyes finally shut, his thoughts drifted back to just what he had seen today. What? His dreams were of magic, monsters, and elves. Like the book he read as a child over 2 centuries ago.